Good afternoon, and welcome and thank you for attending our webinar today. Frank DePiano is my name, and David DePiano will also be presenting with me today. I hope you and your family are remaining safe and are staying healthy. Today, we're going to be able to get a glimpse at how hypnosis and the polygraph are used in criminal investigations, and it's only going to be a glimpse because of the time constraints. Hypnosis, talking about it first, has been around for really centuries. You can trace its roots back to the Egyptian and Greece and then Roman days in some form or another. It's been used for pain management, various treatments, memory recovery, relaxation, and a host of other purposes. Current definitions of hypnosis are somewhat controversial. There's debate about exactly what the essence of hypnosis is. For today, I'm going to use a definition, a simple definition, just an extended period of time of highly focused, concentrated attention. And that'll be what we'll be talking about when I refer to hypnosis today. Hypnosis is used in criminal investigations primarily to generate leads, and that's an important concept to hold on to. It's not used to verify, it's not used to confirm. It's used as a generation of hypotheses or leads that can be then followed up on. The reason for that is that while hypnosis may be useful in a criminal investigation, it can also be misleading. So it generates leads that then can be followed up upon. The polygraph, on the other hand, is relatively recent in its development. Its underpinnings or assumptions have gone on for really centuries. The assumptions were that certain physical changes would occur when someone was being deceptive. Those physical changes might include sweating, more rapid heart rate, dilation of the pupils, and other things that were observed carefully. And then good artists could then say, well, I believe the person's being deceptive based on some of those physical changes. Not till 1921, when a police officer and medical student named John Larson actually began to try and measure those physical responses. Now, some of that came about not because Larson was so creative, but because the physiological measurement techniques were improving. Prior to that, they had not been sufficiently sophisticated to be able to really reliably measure those kinds of indices. But now Larson was able to put together the polygraph, or at least the predecessor of our current polygraph, by measuring skin conductance, sweating, heart rate, breathing rate, and a few other physical measurements. So the polygraph, though, unlike hypnosis, is used to confirm information. So basically, if a polygraph is given, one then makes a determination after the polygraph that the person is either being truthful or deceptive in whatever has been said. There are a number of cases that have been involved in both hypnosis and the polygraph, and I'll talk about a couple of them today. But the important thing to remember is hypnosis, on the one hand, generates leads, builds hypotheses for further investigation. The polygraph, on the other hand, is used to confirm or disconfirm something someone says. Moving over to a case or so, depending on how much time we have. One case that I was involved with several years back was a murder that was outside of a nearby restaurant. Two couples had been eating and then drinking at the restaurant. They had gone out to their car and were sitting in the car talking, probably kissing a little bit. And during that time, a car came up behind them and kind of just stopped and kept the headlights focused in the car. The front seat woman said, "This must be kids, they're bothering us. I'm going to try and get their license plates and report them tomorrow for just bothering us." The car then left, circled the parking lot, and then came back for a second round, and this time actually flashed the high beams into the car. With that, the male in the driver's seat jumped out of the car to confront whoever was doing this. And as he got out of the car, was immediately shot at short range with a sawed-off shotgun, and later died at the scene. When the police looked to question the three remaining witnesses, the three surviving witnesses, the two in the back seat really couldn't see very much, and also were pretty intoxicated and had a hard time recalling and weren't helpful at all to the police. On the other hand, the woman did remember and told the police that she had thought of taking down license plate, but now couldn't remember it and couldn't talk about much else regarding the crime, because it was her fiance that when she looked, he was sprawled out dead in the parking lot ground, and became very emotional when she was interviewed by the police. So they had asked that hypnosis be brought in to see if that could help with some of her memory recovery. And what we did was, she was a good responsive subject. We built in a model that called for her to watch the events on a monitor. And the monitor could be stopped, it could be moved forward, it could be turned off altogether if she became too upset. With those reassurances, she agreed to go forward with the monitor model using hypnosis. And with the hypnosis, she was able to give some detailed descriptions of the men. Unfortunately, they had, like most people today, had covered their face with handkerchiefs, so there wasn't a lot of descriptive things that could be said about them. But she did remember looking at the automobile and trying to remember the license plates number. And what we had her do is move the car slowly and then stop it, move the car slowly and stop it, and then stopped it in a way that she had a pretty good view of the license plates of the car. She was able to identify the state. She was able to identify all 6 digits. She called 6 digits, and then was able to call it a white kind of utility vehicle. The police immediately, while she was still hypnotized, actually did a make on the car and found that it had been stolen not too far away, about 15 miles away from the murder, the night before, actually. And then that became a method for them to begin to track down and identify potential suspects related to the crime. So in this instance, hypnosis was used, again, not to confirm anything, but to see if this information could have generated anything. And the worst case would have been that the numbers and letters didn't match anything, in which case a little bit of time was lost. But up until that point, the police had no leads to go on. So they welcomed the lead to be able to investigate it and dig into it a little bit further. Second case that I'll talk about was an attempted rape that was related to a murder in an adjacent apartment in a community, a local community. 3 weeks prior to a murder that took place, a rather brutal murder where a woman had been stabbed multiple times. Somebody had waited for her to go into her house. She was carrying things. She left the door open. He pushed the door the rest of the way open and then used her kitchen knives, actually, to repeatedly stab her, again, brutally. He eviscerated her and then also left one knife that broke in the side of her head. Police had no leads whatsoever with that. There was no one that could identify anybody waiting outside, and they had only the vaguest kind of suspects that possibly could have done the crime. Meanwhile, 3 weeks prior to that murder, in the same small community, there had been an attempted rape. The attempted rape took place in the apartment of a young woman in her mid-20s, very slight, frail-looking woman. She woke up to what many of us would think is one of the worst things to wake up to. She was living alone and first woke up to the noise that a man made as he entered into her bedroom door. She sat up as he came towards her. He pounced on top of her and kept her pinned to the bed, kept telling her repeatedly, "Stay quiet, you won't get hurt. Just stay quiet and you won't get hurt." Somehow, this young woman got up enough nerve to say, "How are you going to hurt me? You're not going to hurt me. Get out of here. Leave." He said, "I'm going to stab you. You don't have anything. You can't stab me." He sat up then on her and began to reach into his pocket for a knife, apparently. She was able to get her legs out from underneath him and push him off, get out from under him, and then push him off. He then looked to escape. Not thinking, she chased him outside. Once they got outside, she kind of wised up enough to say, "Okay, he's gone. Let me go lock the door and call the police." And that's what she did. When the police interviewed her, and the person that had asked for her to be interviewed was really a homicide detective who was trying to track down leads related to the murder that had taken place. When they tried to interview this woman, when the homicide detective tried to interview her, she became very emotional again, cried, repeatedly would talk about him smelling bad and being disgusting. He's horrible, but gave them no information that would help them identify a possible suspect. So again, hypnosis was brought into the situation, and once again, the notion of a monitor was put into place where she could stop things. And in this particular case, repeatedly the monitor was stopped because even with hypnosis and the relaxation associated with it, she would become fairly upset at recalling the events of that night. With the hypnosis and with about 45 minutes of progressing that monitor on the information, she was able to provide a fairly in-depth description of the perpetrator. There were 2 points. There was a police artist there also. There were 2 points in particular that were focused upon. One was him entering the doorway. So the artist had indicated that we should focus on him in the doorway to get an idea of his size. How far was his head from the top of the doorway? How wide was he in the doorway? So they got an estimate from that as to height and width of the person, how heavy he was. And then once he was on top of her, pinning her down, she had no good look at him at all. His face was literally next to hers. But then when he sat up on her to show her the knife he had, she was about 2.5 feet away from his face and had almost a perfect view of his face. And there we froze the screen and had probably 20 minutes spent on just focusing on forehead, hairline, eyebrows, eyes, jowls, chin, and the police artist drew while she did that during the hypnosis. After the hypnosis, not so surprisingly, the police officer, the artist, showed her the drawing, and she immediately said, "That's him. That's the person. That's the perpetrator that had come into my room." They did apprehend somebody who was a maintenance person working around there regarding the rape. To my knowledge, they were not able to link that back to the murder, which was the initial interest. And that murder goes unsolved to this day, as far as I know. But the idea was to try and link those pieces of information to someone who perhaps had made an attempt to rape somebody, perhaps was an inadequate kind of person to begin with, and then was thwarted and rejected pretty blatantly, and that it created a rage in this person who then took it out on the next person 3 weeks later in that murder. So those are a couple of cases. And again, all that we can give is a snippet and a taste of what hypnosis and such can be looked at in doing criminal investigations. Both the polygraph and hypnosis are used at all levels of law enforcement. Bigger local police will use it. Smaller departments will borrow it from one of the larger departments in their area. State police, in fact, the first case I described was done by the state police in Florida. And then the FBI has units and has published quite a bit actually on hypnosis, and they have a significant unit that depends on the polygraph quite a bit. And I'm going to stop at this point and turn it over to David DePiano, who's going to talk a bit about the legal implications. There are always questions about our pieces of information around hypnosis and hypnosis itself, and or the polygraph. Are they admissible in a court of law? And David, I'll turn to you.
Sure. I'm David DePiano. I'm a local attorney here in South Florida, NSU alum and adjunct professor. I appreciate Dr. Perez and my dad giving me the chance to talk briefly about and give a 10,000-foot view of how hypnosis and polygraph can be used in a courtroom. Under limited circumstances, both are admissible. The interests that are being weighed, and are weighed whenever a court is deciding whether to let information in, are a balance between the need to let a litigant, a plaintiff or a defendant, present all the evidence available to them to pursue their case or their defense, against the concern of unreliable information being presented to a jury, or that a jury will hear a piece of evidence and give it what we call undue weight or too much credit. Generally, for both hypnosis and polygraph, courts around the United States since the 60s, and for polygraph even earlier, have weighed those interests against admissibility. They prevented juries from hearing that evidence. With hypnosis in particular, the concern is that it's unreliable. As my dad mentioned earlier, a participant in hypnosis becomes very suggestive. Memories can be implanted, suggestions can be made by the interviewer that'll then become testimony. And that kind of unreliability is something a court looks to keep out. In the same tenor, there's a lack of inhibition. At least courts have recognized a lack of inhibition by a subject of hypnosis. And that means that if an idea comes to you, you're more likely to say it. You're not gonna be inhibited in any way by a lack of certainty. So in one of my father's case studies, the woman was describing the car. If a blue car popped into her head, normally she may not say it because she'd be concerned it's not accurate. Under hypnosis, she'd be more likely to just say it. And courts, for the same reason as before, don't want inaccurate information brought out in front of a jury. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the bar to hypnosis-based testimony started to come into question. And one of the biggest exceptions that's come about in the last few decades and stuck came from the United States Supreme Court about 3 decades ago. And that's where a defendant and the defendant's own testimony is based on hypnotic recollection. In that case, there was no testimony about what happened in a murder. The woman's only testimony that was available to her, because it was only her and the victim in the room, was derived solely from hypnosis. And in Arkansas, there was a bar on hypnotic-based testimony. The Supreme Court said that's not fair. Due process, which is so fundamental to our justice system in the United States, is notice and an opportunity to be heard. So while some witnesses could be restricted in terms of what hypnotic-based testimony they can give, a defendant in a criminal case can't be, because it violates due process. That doesn't stop the other side from pointing out how unreliable hypnosis is, or from the court deciding based on other evidence that this particular hypnosis-based testimony is too unreliable. But as a general rule, there cannot be a per se bar on a criminal defendant testifying based on hypnotic recollection. There have been other little exceptions here and there, but for the most part, that's remained the case throughout the United States. Polygraph has very similar concerns. There's the weighing of reliability versus allowing a litigant to present all the evidence available to them. But with polygraph, the other concern I mentioned is much more at the forefront, that a jury will give it too much weight, they'll give it too much credit. The courts fear that if they hear that the plaintiff or defendant or witness took a polygraph and passed or failed, that'll be it. They won't consider anything else. They won't look at the other testimony, consider the circumstances. They'll base it solely on the polygraph. And that undue weight concern has led, really since the 30s and the 50s in Florida, courts to generally exclude polygraph. There are exceptions to that. Again, the last few decades, the courts have recognized, including the 11th Circuit, which is the federal court that governs the Southeast United States. There's been a little crack in it, and in U.S. versus Piccanona, the court recognized that it should probably be more of a case-by-case or fact-specific determination, because polygraph technology has advanced, because the training has become better and more standard. The 11th suggested that. And as part of that trend, there's now 2 clear exceptions to polygraph evidence being admissible. And the first is if the parties agree or stipulate, the court won't stop it from coming in. And the second is that polygraph can be used to address the credibility of a witness. There's other requirements in the federal rules of evidence that need to be met, but if those other requirements are met and credibility is put at issue, then polygraph is something that can be laid out there. And these limitations, they're very specific to the courtroom. To emphasize something my father said at the end of his portion, law enforcement is absolutely encouraged to use polygraph and hypnosis to get leads. If those leads help them discover evidence that would otherwise be admissible or free to be shown to the jury, the fact that they were found because of hypnosis or polygraph-based leads wouldn't have any impact on them at all. And that's it.
Okay. Right. In wrapping things up a bit, I'm going to say that both the polygraph and hypnosis are highly dependent on the skill of the administrator. In the polygraph, the order of questions and the type of questions that are asked are crucial in having a valid polygraph developed. Inappropriate administration basically leads to the instrument being an invalid tool. Likewise, hypnosis, as David had mentioned, oftentimes leading questions can be very disruptive in a hypnotic session because the person is much more open and responsive to suggestions. Hypnosis oftentimes is equated with suggestibility. So the fact that they are hypnotized allows them to be much more likely to accept the suggestion. So again, the skill of the hypnotist, and in fact, for anything that I personally, and there are some recommendations for this in the literature, in addition to my having used it this way, I will always record every portion of the interaction with the person that's being hypnotized. And literally, I will turn the camera on prior to them entering my room, leave it running through the entire session, and then not turn it off until they've departed, because even in the pre and post periods, suggestions can be provided, and given that the whole environment was a hypnotic environment, they could in fact influence what the person recalls. And there was a person named Martin Orn who studied extensively at the University of Pennsylvania, studied extensively false memories, and found that in fact memories that the person would be completely convinced of could be produced using hypnosis. So the care has to be taken not to ask leading questions, not to make suggestions, and then for the sake of the process, the court or whatever process is going to look at the hypnotic period, that everything is recorded, so that if there is an accusation that somehow these memories were introduced during the hypnosis, one can review the tape and see that in fact they were not. So Carlos, we're going to stop there and move on. I think you have questions in mind at this point.
That's correct. We have several questions. I'm going to introduce Erica and Megan. Megan, Megan and Erica, you want to start off with some of the questions that have come in?
Sure. So just a brief introduction. My name is Erica. I'm currently in the clinical mental health counseling program, and I work with Dr. Perez. And I'm really excited to be involved in this. And actually, these questions are really wonderful. The first one that I saw that really caught my attention, I think, is a very important question when it comes to mental health. It says, does the hypnosis process affect the victim mentally because it involves reminding them of the situation that they have experienced?
I'll go ahead and respond to that. And the straightforward answer is yes, it could. That's why a lot of care needs to be taken to reassure the subject. I personally like using the imagery of a monitor that can be shut off if you see that the person is becoming overly emotional, overly upset. You can stop things. If it's bad enough, you can stop the session altogether. And there have been a couple of cases that I've worked on over the years where I have terminated the hypnosis because the person became so emotional and so upset by what was being recalled that they really couldn't handle it. More often than not, despite fear and apprehension, especially for victims and to some extent witnesses also, they have an interest in getting around their feelings, their fear, their emotions, to be able to create justice. They want to see somebody who attempted, in the example I gave, attempted to rape them. They want to see that person captured and punished for what they did. So more often than not, they're willing to work around their fear. And again, if you bring in some protection in the potential rape, the attempted rape situation, I even use the fact that there were a bunch of police officers at the state level that were very curious about the process. And the room we were in wasn't a very big room, but there were about 6 to 8 police officers in the room. I even used that to reassure the person that they were relatively safe because of the law enforcement presence, as well as it being on television, and we can stop it, turn it off anytime we want. So good question. And yes, you need to be careful that you're not creating more problems than good when you're using the hypnosis with people that have been through trauma.
Hi everyone, my name's Megan and I'm in the Clinical Psychology PsyD program at Nova. I'm currently in the Forensics concentration. The first question that I have from here is, so if a victim recalls the details about an incident via hypnosis, it won't be admissible in court.
Go ahead.
The victim themselves probably isn't the defendant. So in all likelihood in Florida and in most of the states, depends a bit on the jurisdiction, the hypnotic recollection won't be admissible for the reasons we talked about. Everything in law is case by case, and the answer you'll get anytime you ask a lawyer is it depends. But what I'll say is, if you're not a criminal defendant, you're going to have an uphill challenge to have any hypnotic-based testimony be allowed to be presented to the jury.
Yeah, I think David mentioned in the 80s there was a precedent case that allowed for the defendant to have certain rights that others may not have the right to bring forward in court. In the sense of defending oneself, anything can be brought forward, including, I think you said, hypnotic testimony.
That's right, subject to challenge from the other side. And the reasoning is based on that same balancing. While a victim has an interest in presenting evidence and pursuing justice, the justice system and the integrity of the justice system depends on judges acting as gatekeepers and making sure that that interest, the interest of the victim, is weighed against how reliable the evidence is and how much undue credit the jury may give it. And typically, unless it's a criminal defendant, the interest in reliability and undue weight outweighs the interest of presenting evidence.
But just expanding on a little bit off that question, but related to it, it still doesn't render hypnosis as not very potent or useful in the process, in that if some information is brought forward and it's early in the investigative process, law enforcement has the opportunity to go verify and find other pieces of information that can be brought into the court. So again, it depends, as I said right in the beginning, as a hypothesis generator, as something that generates things that can be further investigated, that's the greatest value. So that usually takes place earlier in the investigative timeline. Later, you're looking to confirm things. And there, I think there's a lot of concerns that I would have about hypnosis looking to confirm that person A, in fact, was the perpetrator versus person B. There, the reliability drops down. But where you can go back and verify it with other pieces of evidence, that's where the greatest value with hypnosis occurs.
That's a good point.
So we actually had this question come in prior to the webinar today, but I think it is an important question to be asked. This person says that they say, I'm really interested in forensic psychology, but I'm not currently working as a clinician or in criminal justice. What would you recommend as options?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. Options to be able to function as a hypnotist? Is that?
I think to work in the field of forensic psychology without being currently clinically working or in the criminal justice kind of system.
Well, in order to be an expert, and David can probably say more about this than I would be able to say, the threshold is relatively low to be an expert. One doesn't have to be in the field. One doesn't have to be a law enforcement officer. One doesn't have to be an attorney. One doesn't have to have a license in a particular profession like psychology or medicine necessarily to be identified as an expert. There's some liability to not having those credentials in that the cross-examination can always look to discredit the person. But from the court's point of view, it's my belief that the threshold is relatively low. Is that correct, David?
Sure, they vary across the states, and again, it depends. But if you use a method that's recognized by the community, scientific community, to come to a certain determination, and you have either some experience or some education that's at least related to the field, most judges will let it in and be subject to cross, as opposed to keeping it out altogether. The interest in presenting evidence there would outweigh the interest in reliability and undue weight, and they'd leave it to the opposing attorney, as Dad pointed out, to give it to the expert who wasn't qualified.
Okay.
So the next question is, can you hypnotize someone who does not want to be hypnotized or who does not believe that it will help them solve a problem?
There's controversy around the answer to that question too. In my own experience, I found that people that are motivated to be hypnotized, that they see something in it for them, are the most responsive to the hypnosis. There have been some that say they can hypnotize despite somebody's resistance. I've not found that to be the case, though. Cooperation is important. Certainly someone can deceive, think they're deceiving during hypnosis if they chose to do that. So where I've seen the greatest positive results is where the individuals themselves were motivated for one reason or another, whether it be pain management or remembering something that was important to remember, that where that motivation was high, that's where they've been the most responsive and the most positive effects have occurred.
So I've seen several different questions come up regarding the use of hypnosis for children, and I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, because there's been a couple different questions about whether or not they could be, whether or not hypnosis could be used on children, or if there's a certain age limit. So if you guys could talk about that a little bit, I think that would be wonderful.
Sure, we can. Hypnosis, the child needs to be sophisticated enough. So 5, 6, 7 years old, roughly, if you look at age numerically, to be able to pay attention and stay focused on things for a bit of time. Prior to that age, it's more difficult for them to do that. But actually, children respond very well, mostly because during an induction for hypnosis, you're asking a person to suspend a lot of the general reality testing that they'd be asked to do, that they're getting sleepy when maybe it's the middle of the day and they're not sleepy, that their arm may be getting lighter when in fact there's nothing to make it get lighter except their own imagination about it. Children play fantasy all the time, so they're much more used to being able to let go and engage in the kinds of things that are being suggested and the kind of fantasy that you're asking them to engage in as you tell someone to imagine that they're off in a very relaxed place, just enjoying a cool breeze and sunshine. The children are better able to suspend judgment. And actually, I'll say this to our 2 graduate students, the worst subjects, the most difficult subjects that have the hardest time are graduate students. Because everything about graduate school is don't assume anything, don't accept anything someone's saying, be critical about the analysis. And that process actually works to slow down the hypnosis and make it more difficult for those people to be able to be hypnotized. They can still be hypnotized, it's just a little more difficult.
The next question is, what do you do when your clients, before the lie detector test, uses anxiety meds or hypertension meds to lower their blood pressure?
You want to take that, or you want me to?
I think I would object. I would, if the opposing party agreed to take a polygraph test, and my polygraph expert in the pre-polygraph clinical interview stumbles upon the opposing party being under the influence of any drug, especially one that would inhibit or affect in any way the physiological response to a stressful question or a stressful answer, especially if it's a lie, I would object, and I would either ask that they agree or ask the court to require that he comes back when he's no longer under the influence of those drugs.
So you discredit the process, basically.
I would stop the process if I could.
Yeah, yeah, and you've got to remember with the polygraph, you're looking at differential responses. So it's why the artist, the person doing the administration skill level is so important. You need to get a baseline on a person, so you see how they're answering sensitive questions that aren't related to the lie or possible lie. They're asked to respond to non-sensitive questions. What's your name? How old are you? Those kinds of questions. So you're getting a baseline on all those physiological measures. And then you're going to occasionally introduce one of the very relevant to the crime or to whatever the deceit's around. You're going to introduce those, and you're looking for a differential response. So if somebody's medicated, they may have a suppressed response all through, but still the assumption would be that as they got to the critical point, there'd be some change in that. So change is the important element, and that's why the artistry of administration is so important. There have been situations where people have done things to induce changes. So I guess the classic sabotage is to put a thumbtack in your shoe, and then at different times when you're being asked neutral questions, press down on the thumbtack. The pain causes then the physical changes that mimic or look much like somebody being deceptive. So now you have someone who's looking deceptive at, is today Thursday, and is looking deceptive at, did you go steal that money? And that makes it impossible to make a distinction. If they're caught at that, if the good administrator is able to detect that they're biting the inside of their cheek, or that they're pressing down with their foot and takes off the shoe and sees the tack, it serves to discredit the subject, and it allows the polygrapher to be able to make a comment about them trying to undermine the polygraph, which then puts their credibility, makes their credibility suspect.
What prerequisites does a polygrapher need, and is there certain certification required, or are there reputable schools that you could share?
I don't know that one.
All right. There is, in Florida, I'm not sure about other states, there is certification required. It's an extensive training period, 6 months or more. And it includes both an understanding of physiological changes, as well as then the actual administration of the test. And the third piece of it is the interpretation of it, because afterwards you have now computerized, but graphs of the different responses, and you have to pull those apart from each other and analyze one set of responses to another. So all of those things are covered in training programs in Florida. They're mostly, I don't know offhand, I know major entities do. The FBI provides training. The CIA also provides training. So major law enforcement bodies provide training. There are also private entities. Most local police departments are going to be too small to be able to provide an actual training. They're going to get the training elsewhere if they want to use the polygraph and then bring the person on board. But there are private entities that you could look on a web. And I think one of the references at the end of this, there'll be a list of references. If you've got a little more interest in any of these topics, you can dig into. And I think one or two of the references give some information about training. One by the CIA, I remember, and another one might be a local group that provides training. They're certified to certify you as a polygrapher to then be eligible for state state certification to be able to provide the polygraph. So yes, there are those opportunities. I don't know, and this doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I don't know of a university-based training program. Maybe some law enforcement type university might have some training in polygraph, but I don't know of any offhand.
Dad, you took a course, didn't you?
We did. I offered one just as a outside the curriculum course some years ago, and then was curious enough about it that I sat through the training program. Yes.
You think being a psychologist helped?
Not particularly, no.
Unrelated.
No, I thought it was unrelated. I thought having any professional background, medical, law, psychology, might be a little bit of an advantage, but they have the mentality around what's been agreed upon to be certified is pretty circumscribed and limited to their point of view about it. So having the other pieces, I'll admit that I'd ask some questions that the trainer would prefer me not to have answered, but it came more from the outside than what they needed to do as inside trainers in polygraphy.
Interesting.
So the next question is, during the hypnosis session, like the 2 cases mentioned, how much of the crime scene is told to the person as they fill in the blanks?
The crime scene.
Well, I can say from my perspective, part of why, as my father suggested, you should always record the session. If it's going to be used in a courtroom or in any way related to evidence in a courtroom, the more that the interviewer suggests, the more unreliable the subject's testimony resulting from the interview is going to be considered, at least from my perspective and generally from a court's perspective. I don't know clinically how you feel about it.
Yeah, I think the less you tell them and the more that you're getting from them, it's going to be their information. You obviously have heard everything second or third hand. You weren't at the crime, they were. So in that sense, the less that you're giving them, the better. You're going to feed back things to them, but it's going to be things that they've already reported. So even a very emotional subject is going to have given some information to the police. So in the case that I gave as an example, you had a young woman who said, I remembered even saying, let me take down that plate number and report them tomorrow. So I was able to feed that back to her. You remember saying that. Now we want to move the car, and you're going to look closely at the car as it stopped there, frozen on the screen. Go ahead and study it. Take your time. But nothing's introduced. It's all things being fed back that they gave. I think, as David said, to bring in pieces that you somehow assume could distort the process and make it less valid.
This is, I think, a good question. Is there any way to know who's a better subject to be
They've all been good
hypnotized or
questions
not?
so far. Say the question again.
Is there any way to know who is a better subject to be hypnotized or not?
In my experience, motivation. Somebody that has a really strong reason for wanting to be hypnotized, to the extent it's part of a training program and they aren't even that curious about it, they become more difficult to hypnotize. Where motivation is high, I really want to find out who that person was that did that to me, that stole my money or attempted that rape, or where pain is extensive and they're looking to have somebody reduce down and control the pain. Where that motivation is high, there's the strongest indication that they'll be good subjects. Beyond that, there are standardized susceptibility scales that have been developed by various researchers out of Stanford, Harvard, other places, that will measure hypnotic suggestibility. How responsive is a person likely to be? And usually they're 10 to 12 item scales where someone is given suggestions and then you see how well they're responding to those suggestions. So you do have those scales that you can give. They're time consuming, so you've got to factor that in. Whereas where I see highly motivated people, I can usually just off that forecast that they'll be pretty good subjects. And then some other things matter too: the comfort level, the trust that they have in you as a professional, like all clinical work. Those are going to make, and legal work for that matter, the trust that someone has in an attorney is going to make a difference in how comfortable they are following the lead of that person. So some trust, but a lot of motivation, I think, makes the biggest difference in making a very quick judgment. Again, you can go into deeper assessment using the scales, but they take up to an hour to administer. So there is some time involved with that.
So there's been a couple of questions about lying for the polygraph and hypnosis. How can you tell? And also, can you fail a polygraph when telling the truth? How would you know?
So let me go to the first part. How can you tell when one is lying? With hypnosis, a person very easily could say things that in fact aren't true, and there's, except for verification, go back and verify, there's no way really to tell. Two, I won't go into the real case detail, but two situations that I know of. One, a person was brought into a session to hypnotize somebody who confessed to a murder, said that he killed his, I think, sister-in-law. Maybe it was his mother-in-law, I forget now. But in that situation, the person confessed to it, fully said, I did it, I'm guilty, had been intoxicated and emotional, obviously, around the murder, and couldn't recall where the body was. Well, for the law enforcement people, that created a problem. They like to have bodies when there are homicides. The person was brought through a session of hypnosis. Halfway through the session, wasn't very responsive, kept fidgeting and moving. Halfway through the session, sat up and said, look, I'm really trying to cooperate with all this. I'm not hypnotized, and I'm just making up the stuff that I'm telling you. The police, though, the law enforcement people, followed up on what he had told them, and were able to find the body almost exactly where he had said he put it, even though he'd said, I'm making all this up, it's not real. I don't really know where the body is. So there's that kind of a situation. There also, at one point, local police had called me in to verify something with a young woman who midday had car problems. She had a van. Somebody stopped, quote, to help her, and then she made a report that the person had pushed her into the van and raped her in the van. The police woman doing the investigation had some doubts about the story and asked if I could hypnotize her. And I told her no, that yes, I could hypnotize her, but that would not help her at all decipher whether or not this was a true story or she was fabricating it. So in that sense, the hypnosis, the only way you're going to be able to verify, and what I tell law officers all the time, go back and find whatever was said and find hard evidence for whatever was said. These are just things that people are saying, and they may be true, they may not be true, but at least you've got something to go investigate. As for the polygraph, is it possible? Yeah, there have been situations where people have come out as having been deceptive when later it was found that they're not. Those are, I don't know probabilities on it. It's relatively rare, but it can happen. And also the other, where people are seen as not telling a lie, but then in fact were found out later to tell a lie. So in either case, it's not 100%. So it's a probability that you're looking at when you bring forward the results of your testing.
So Dr. Perez has mentioned that this is the last question, and I'm actually very curious about the answer to this, mostly because I don't know what the other option is, but someone has asked what the difference between a polygraph and a CBSA test is.
I don't know that. Do you know that, David?
Nope.
No, I don't. You stumped us.
Wow. Okay, I'll see if I can find one more real quick. The one right underneath that says, do you find that religion plays a role in some subjects not wanting to be hypnotized?
I've not found that to be the case. No, I've not found somebody on religious basis. Again, a lot has to do with the situation. If they're in counseling, let's say therapy, they're already exposed their inner thoughts and feelings. So it's nothing new to use the hypnosis to try and do a bit more of that. So no, I've not seen religion as being an issue for the people that I've worked with over the years or have heard about that. I suppose anything's possible, but I've not seen it.
And I haven't either, but if the opportunity comes up, I'll make the argument if it can prevent my client from being subject to a polygraph.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Is there any parting words?
No, appreciate the good questions that came out of the audience and appreciate your attention, audience, for listening up. Thank you.
And you should be able to now see some of those references that we referred to.
Okay. Yeah, those references are just if you have, there's nothing special about them, but if you have additional information, there are a few on the polygraph and a few on hypnosis, in particular on hypnosis and recall. So just for your information as an audience.
And we want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're going to be staying on in case anyone has specific questions. Our email is psychology@nova.edu. If somebody's interested in perhaps our forensic psychology program, which is offered online. And also, please do share these opportunities with your friends, families, and colleagues. Nova.edu/Shark Chats.
And Carlos, I'll add to that, if there are questions that come to people later on through that email, if you'd be willing to forward them to me, I'd be happy to try and answer them even down the road a bit if that's the case.
Thank you very much. We typically get a few hundred questions, so those are fun to, and when we get into content specific questions, it can be a little bit challenging. So thank you very much for signing on. We will be staying with you in case anyone has questions regarding NSU. But thank you very much again for our panelists and our students that read our questions, Erica and Megan. Thank you very much.